Good afternoon. Welcome to the Drell Lecture. I'm Rod Ewing, a co-director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. For CSAC, the Drell Lecture is a major event each year. We gather to learn about the latest security threats to the nation, but we also gather to remember and honor those who have first created and then shaped CSAC over the years. The Sidney Drell Lecture was endowed by Albert Whelan and his wife Cicely to honor Sid Drell. Sid and Bud met each other first when Bud was a graduate student at MIT. Bud went on to become the founding director of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, and once in this position, he called upon Sid Drell's help for a number of technical issues. Perhaps one of the most interesting stories has to do with the very secret Corona satellite project. Sid Drell was called in with other gifted scientists, such as Richard Garwin, to help with a satellite surveillance system that finally included some 95 satellites collecting images of the former Soviet Union. And actually, I was just reading the other day about this. The technology was fantastic. Capsules that weighed over 100 pounds were jettisoned and captured or caught in the air by airplanes, and then these rolls of film were developed and examined. The Corona satellite program was very important because it was the first time the U.S. had an idea about the size of the Soviet missile force. And as it turned out, it was smaller than anticipated. And it also opened the door to arms control discussions because the satellite imagery could be used to confirm Soviet strength of various weapon systems. And so after that, Sid Drell continued. He was a member of the so-called Land Committee, which advised CIA directors for several decades. In 1983, Sid Drell and John Lewis created CSAC. The concept of two directors is unique. And the reason we have two directors is because CSAC represents an effort to combine science and engineering with the social sciences at a technology policy interface so that we get the best of all involved. We have a new co-director, and so it's my pleasure to welcome Colin Kahl to the leadership team for CSAC. Colin is the inaugural Stephen Haase Senior Fellow, an endowed position at FSI. He comes to us from Georgetown University, but before that, from 2014 to 2017, he was a senior advisor to President Obama and Vice President Biden. Colin will do the honors of introducing today's Drell Lecture. Colin?
Thanks, Rod. Hello, everybody. I'm Colin Kahl. I'm thrilled to be the new social science co-director for CSAC, and it's my great honor today to introduce our speaker, Alex Stamos. As most of you know, Alex is an adjunct professor at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, FSI, as well as a William J. Perry International Security Fellow at CSAC and a visiting scholar here at the Hoover Institution, which is kind enough to host us in this lovely facility. Alex is one of the nation's leading cybersecurity experts with extensive experience in the private sector, most recently as the former chief security officer for Facebook, which you probably know is a small company down the road in Menlo Park. And prior to that, he was the chief security officer for Yahoo, and earlier a co-founder of ISEC Partners, a security consulting firm. Although he holds a degree from UC Berkeley, we don't hold that against him, and we've been welcoming of Alex here at Stanford. We're very excited about the work that he's doing already to help us better understand the ways in which various malign actors are utilizing social media and the internet to challenge our democracy and our security. So without further ado, let's all give a warm welcome to Alex Stamos, who's going to talk to us about the battle for the soul of the internet.
Good afternoon. Provost Drell, Ambassador McFall, distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, thank you for being with us here tonight. I first want to thank Rod and Colin for the opportunity to give this talk, and to admit I'm a little bit nervous. This is my first lecture in an academic context, and looking around the room, it's already pretty clear that there are some differences between this audience and the hacker conferences that I feel more comfortable speaking at, not just in academic credentials, but most obviously in the amount of body piercings. When I was asked to give this Drell lecture, I was honored to follow speakers like Bill Perry, Ash Carter, Sally Ride, and I wanted to understand what we were talking about in the memory of Sid Drell. So I was able to go into the Stanford Library Archives and find, in his own words, Dr. Drell's belief in the responsibility of scientists and engineers to society. So let's hear from him what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Not each individual scientist has an obligation to help society make choices when changes that are the result of scientific progress in the conditions of society are developing. Science itself is amoral. It has no moral content because it's a voyage of exploration on uncharted seas. But after a bit, when you realize that the consequences of deeper scientific understanding are new technologies, new weapons, new energy sources, one has an obligation, I believe, as the creator of these changes, to help society make the choices of how to improve the conditions of life, or to make the risk of conflict versus peace, to reduce that. That calls upon us to act with our best scientific knowledge. If we confuse our political views with our scientific analysis, we lose credibility. And so it is important that we speak as scientists and identified as such, but we also have the right as human beings to speak our own views. We just have to identify when we're talking as scientists and when we're talking our own prejudices.
So his words are obviously based upon the threat of global nuclear warfare and his experiences in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But his belief in the responsibility of science and technologists, I think, is still very, very relevant today, and also stands as a pretty stark contrast to the way my colleagues and I have spoken about the responsibility of tech and its relationship with the world. There's a man who is, some of you might know of, who's very, very influential, a man named John Perry Barlow. You can't really say he's from Silicon Valley. He grew up on a cattle ranch in Wyoming and spent much of his career writing the lyrics for the Grateful Dead. So not a technologist, but somebody who is deeply involved in creating kind of the intellectual framework by which technologists understood the world in the very early days of the internet. And he wrote a very influential piece called A Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. And as you can see, this declaration, which was written in 1996 as a direct reaction to the Communications Decency Act, which was passed by Congress that year, as you can see, this declaration says explicitly that cyberspace is something that stands apart from existing society, that the people who are building cyberspace should be building something that is both greater and free from the bonds that have been placed on our society in the past. And this is I don't want to beat up on Barlow for this. He did a lot of great things. He did pass away earlier this year. But I do believe that there is something, a kernel of belief encapsulated in this document that somewhat explains how we got to where we are today, is this belief that the online world is something that stands apart from the rest of society and can kind of break free of the bonds of history and civilization. And that is a lesson that has been proven to be incorrect the hard way multiple times for Silicon Valley. And there have been multiple situations in which the Valley has learned about its place in the world. One important one was in 2009 when Google and 34 other companies were attacked by the People's Republic of China. And that was a big lesson on the dangers of working with a state like the PRC, but also a lesson that nation states would put incredible resources behind control of the information environment, especially the information environment for their own citizens. But I think a really important turning point was the Tahrir Square uprising of 2011 in the context of the overall Arab Spring of that year. This was seen as a demonstration of tech as a liberating force. The Tahrir Square uprising, the uprising in other Arab capitals, was driven by technology, was driven by the fact that these people had the ability to communicate with one another in a way free from interference for the first time in their history, and that they were able to organize and to build these democracy movements from nothing. There were even in 2011, some signs that this might not hold very well. And during the Arab Spring, there were a number of reactions that were actually quite surprising to those of us in Silicon Valley, because they came from countries that you normally would not consider cyber warfare powers, countries like Tunisia, who built a capability to inject JavaScript into the login page of Facebook and to use that to see what people were posting and to round up dissidents who were using Facebook to organize online. You saw the equivalent things happening in other platforms where this tool of freedom was then turned around and used for oppression. And as the Arab Spring fizzled out, and a number of autocrats, sometimes different autocrats, retained control, we started to see that there was a naivete to the belief that the internet was going to be a permanently revolutionizing force. This is what Tahrir Square looked like 2 years later in Egypt. And now the government in charge in Egypt is no better than that one overthrown in 2011 from a human rights perspective, but they are much more savvy about the use of technology to control the population and how to control the attention and the communications of the people. There are a number of other examples, including the fact that there's kind of a real old canard that the internet is going to be a democratizing force in China. And a number of people who said that entire lives have been now outlived by the Chinese Communist Party, who has demonstrated that the existence of the internet does not automatically mean that you're going to have freedom. It can be used as a tool of almost complete societal control. And we also see oppression and violence being spread in much less organized ways, such as in Sri Lanka or in India, where the internet has been used by both people in power and by dispossessed groups to put groups together and to cause religious ethnic violence. Also, it's pretty clear the internet has become one of the most interesting areas for great power conflict. I think there's several reasons for this. The first is that actions online allow great powers to import their will onto other countries in a way that falls short of the traditional definitions of warfare. In 2016, there was a concerted and professional effort to influence the 2016 election. I don't see any red hats out there, so I might be able to get through this speech with people believing it. But from my perspective and from the data and the information I saw, there was an attempt by the Russian Federation to influence the 2016 election. There was two parts to that attack, one run by the Main Intelligence Directorate, or GRU, one run by a variety of independent groups, including the Internet Research Agency of St. Petersburg. But all of their activity fell underneath the bar under which clearly our country considered an unacceptable use of cyber conflict capability. And as a result, we have demonstrated almost no response to demonstrate that that was an inappropriate thing to happen. The other interesting part about the use of the internet for great powers is it really enables you to even out asymmetries. We talk today in our political sphere of Vladimir Putin standing astride the world and all of the rest of us dancing as puppets on the strings of the GRU and SVR and groups like the IRA because of their use of roughly 80,000 Facebook posts, $100,000 in ads, and a hacking campaign that is not beyond the capabilities of just standard organized crime groups. But we speak about the incredible power they have, And we do so even though Putin is overseeing a slowly failing petrochemical economy that has roughly the GDP half the size of California, and a military that does not measure up close to either its own glory or the other major militaries of NATO. And by using cyber power, they have created the ability to project power into these countries through fear and fear alone. And that capability seems fascinating considering that the actions they took had no direct impact on people's lives, but have completely changed the ways we consider our relationship with Russia and the kind of capabilities they have. So a lot of people then look at these problems and kind of turn to Silicon Valley and ask the Valley, why don't you fix this problem? And the answer is, well, for a long time, the Valley was not fixing these problems. And that is clearly true, that we were not focused on the real issues that we had to be focused on. But there's more to fixing the problems than that. There's an old engineering adage. You can have two of these three things. You can have something done fast, done correctly, or done cheaply, right? And really, this is an optimization problem. The thought here is if in any kind of engineering project, you have to optimize for two of these three things, you got to pick a point in this triangle of whether you want something done correctly, quickly, or cheaply. But the optimization problem, when you talk about these kinds of issues, about the interaction of online communication platforms that span billions of people, and the laws and norms of hundreds of countries, and the reality of the engineering challenges you face, you actually are talking about a much more difficult problem. And it looks maybe something closer to this. The reality of the interaction to internet society is there's lots and lots of laudable goals and equities. There's lots of things that everybody agrees should be good. And I think most of the things up here, we would all agree are good goals that should be strived for. But this chart actually turns out to be an oversimplification because you can't just pick a point somewhere in this star. The relationship between these equities is actually very, very complex. And if you move towards any of these equities, say anonymity, or you move towards minimized data collection, you end up moving away from other equities, not just in a complex way that interacts with each other, but sometimes non-linearly, right? That a small change towards one of them will really reduce your ability to reach any of these other equities. And when I talk about the battle for the soul of the internet, what I really mean is the battle to decide where do the products that we use every day fall on this chart? What are the decisions that we are making of the equities that we care about the most? And most importantly, probably, who is actually making that decision? And is that person accountable to anybody but themselves, or in some cases, their shareholders? And we're not going to solve these problems tonight. We definitely do not have time to talk about all of these. But what I'd like to do is talk about a couple of these trade-offs in more detail so we can try to explore and tease out a little bit why these are difficult problems and what kinds of things we can do in academia and in Silicon Valley to address them in a smarter way than we've been doing so far. And probably, the obvious one that a lot of people have heard about, thanks to the Apple San Bernardino case and a variety of other ones, is the argument over privacy versus data access in the Western world. And this is a fight generally between law enforcement and national security folks on one side, and people representing large technology companies on the other. And at the base, the question is, are tech products allowed to be built that put data completely beyond the control of corporations or governments? That is really the question. There's a variety of implementation questions here about, are you talking about stored data on a phone? Are you talking about communications? But the real question is, are you allowed to put data beyond your own reach? Are you allowed to build a product where you can no longer control how that product is used? There's a lot of well-trod territory on this argument, and I don't want to go into great detail. Personally, I am a big believer that individuals should have the ability to communicate with one another without a government or corporation controlling that or surveilling that. But that is not necessarily automatically true. And there's clearly a number of difficult moral questions that are built into a position like that. But instead of diving into this too much, what I do want to say is that although this is an argument we've had for almost 20 years now, it is still one that is very far from being solved. A recent ministerial meeting of the Five Eyes, the Anglophone countries that along with the United States all cooperate together on intelligence matters, that ministerial meeting put out a communique talking about the risk from end-to-end encryption and demonstrating that there might be a unified move by a number of Western democracies against encryption all at once. And we might be starting to see that in Australia, where the Australian Parliament right now is, instead of using, they never use the word backdoor, but start to talk about technical assistance responsibilities of international companies, that we might start to see a move in this area in the West to make it very, very difficult to deploy these kinds of products and make those decisions. That's going to have some pretty big consequences, not just the obvious consequence of that data being able to go into the hands of these governments, but the less obvious consequence of making all these products a little bit less secure and getting rid of a really powerful tool that big companies have to actually promise privacy and to back it up with math. But while this debate gets a lot of the focus, there's actually a new growing privacy and safety debate that I think is going to become more important, and that's also a lot harder to argue over. The positions in this debate have actually solidified pretty hard. Like, most people are on one side or the other, and there's not a lot of conversation. But the real debate, I think, that we're coming up is the trade-off of the use of data to enforce norms and rules and laws, and whether or not that data should be in the hands of private companies or the government, or neither. And to have that discussion, to have the privacy discussion, you actually have to be using a standardized language. And one of the problems we have about this debate right now is that people just talk about big clouds of data, that this company has my data, and these guys have my data, and somebody stole my data, and my data was breached. And it's not very helpful. We really need to focus on what are the kinds of data that we talk about when we talk about these kinds of breaches. And the way I would classify these trade-offs is with three categories. The first is the data that is absolutely necessary for a product to work. So, for example, I use Google Photos. I upload my family photos. I use that to share it with my family. Pretty clearly, for Google Photos to work, they have to have access to my photos, right? It's just not going to work otherwise. And I don't have much place to complain that Google is sitting on photos that I have intentionally uploaded to them and that their product has to hold on to if they want to have the ability to do the things I ask them to do. The second category is data that is collected that is necessary at the time but is often held for too long or is used for purposes other than what it necessarily be used for. And there's a whole set of different technical reasons why you might gather too much data, perhaps even accidentally, but then not make the right decision of how to handle it in the long term. And the third is the category that I think actually gets Silicon Valley in the most trouble, but isn't, strangely enough, the focus of privacy advocates, which is the data that you just don't have to have as a tech company. Unfortunately, most of this debate is actually about the stuff in the green circle. Most of the time, when you hear about a privacy scandal in Silicon Valley, they are talking about data that company absolutely has to have. And that's unfortunate because it lets the company off the hook and it gets rid of the ability to have a good nuanced conversation about what actually needs to happen here and whether they overstepped. And on the red, I think, is the unnecessarily collected data. That's the easy one that we can all agree needs not to happen. The challenge there is coming up with regulators and regulations that can figure out what that is and penalties that keep people from keeping it. But the hard part is the yellow. And the yellow is where we are going to see lots and lots of fights over the next several years. Perhaps fights that only happen in private, but they will happen because that is the data that is often necessary to keep people safe. When we talk about these kind of critical turning points in the history of Silicon Valley and society, another critical one is the rise of ISIS. And perhaps the situation that most crystallized the responsibility of the Valley via ISIS was the Paris attacks of November 2015. 230 people were killed in those attacks, and most of the attackers actually had European passports. They were legally in Europe and had been radicalized remotely. Now, while there's no sign that encrypted messengers were used to plan the attacks, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that all of the communication was done unencrypted or between people interpersonally, there was a legitimate pushback from the governments involved that the tech companies were not doing enough to understand how their platforms were being used to recruit and to radicalize individuals in Europe. And that fear is based in reality, and is because ISIS did something that was pretty unique, in that they built a whole coterie of people, of young, technically advanced, mostly Muslim men in Europe who were able to support them from a technological perspective. That could have been by providing actual hacking capabilities, and it could have been through their ability to manipulate social media. This was a huge challenge for the platforms taking care of this. And part of that was because there was a real mismatch and the expectations of how easy it is to enforce rules against the celebration of terrorism and the recruiting of terrorist targets. The bottom right corner is an example of something that is very, very difficult, which is something that ISIS was very famous for, unfortunately, at the time, which is the creation of these beheading videos, where they would kill people on camera in an incredibly gruesome way, and then wrap that video in a very kind of modern and advanced and professionally produced media package, and they would try to get that played in as many places as possible. One of the common refrains at the time was, well, why don't we just ban beheading videos? Why don't you ban any screenshot from beheading videos? Well, this example, I actually pulled this screenshot from BBC, right? There is a real journalistic need for people to talk about the actions of groups like ISIS, even if they completely condemn them. And trying to make decisions around the context of, here's a beheading video, here's an excerpt of a beheading video, here's a screenshot from a video, those kinds of decisions are spectacularly difficult to make, even if you have an infinite amount of time. And one of the things people need to learn is the truth is any kind of content moderation at scale, time is the one thing you don't have. You have a very small amount of time if you want a human being to be making these decisions. This also demonstrated the scope of the problem, and that as you had big tech companies start to get a grasp on these issues, ISIS was an intelligent adversary, and like water finding cracks, they found lots of ways to use the internet without touching the platforms that had the capability to respond. And so as these folks moved off of Twitter and Facebook, they would move on to sites like Pinterest. Now, ISIS isn't really into crocheted stuff or cute little porcelain dolls. That's not why they were on Pinterest. They were on Pinterest because that's a company that was not expecting this to become an issue. They moved a lot of their communication not onto end-to-end encrypted platforms where they knew they would be tracked. At least if their information was encrypted, they knew the metadata would be available to law enforcement. They moved onto platforms where people were not expecting this at all. For example, the Sony PlayStation network was being used for people to have point-to-point voice discussions that were not theoretically protected by encryption, but were practically protected because that company did not have people in place to go monitor and look for this kind of behavior. This was a big deal, and it was a very difficult problem for tech to deal with in the 2015-2016 timeframe, but we slowly got a handle on it, and a lot of this work, especially in Europe, has gotten a lot better. But a lot of that safety work has actually run into a brick wall, and the acronym for that brick wall is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Now we have a European parliamentarian here, so I don't want to be too rough on GDPR. I would like to be able to travel to Europe again on vacation. But this is a real demonstration of the different ways that different societies look at regulating the internet and whether or not there's the proper foreseeing of unintended consequences and whether or not countries are lining up the incentives in the way they should. So as many of you know, GDPR has replaced the European Privacy Directive that was in place for many, many years and came into effect this year in May of 2018 and has really revolutionized the way people think about building their products in Europe. I think in many cases, that's a totally reasonable thing. And if you look at the language of GDPR, most of the statements it makes are very reasonable and sound great to any normal person. But the real problem with GDPR is that nobody really knows what it means. Nobody really knows what its impact is. Nobody who says they're GDPR compliant can actually make that promise. And this is why you should be careful of anything I say, because if I say I really know what GDPR means, I too am lying. Because the truth is GDPR is a very broad set of guidelines that now have to be applied by 28 different national data protection authorities. And we are going to have years and years of litigation around what terms like undo mean and delay mean, and what does it mean to notify people at a reasonable time, and what is a reasonable expectation of privacy. These are terms for which there is some case law, but there is going to be lots and lots of lawsuits, and as always, the lawyers are going to win in this battle because they'll be on both sides. And we're really not going to know what GDPR means for 5 to 10 years. But in that period of time during which all of this upheaval happens, we have to still deal with these problems. And two of the issues that are interesting is one, GDPR is going to be giving intelligent adversaries a very powerful tool called Article 17, which under current interpretations will give them a lot of ability to request that platforms delete their data. And I think when you look at the elections in 2019, one of the most interesting ones is going to be the European parliamentary elections, because I guarantee the IRA, GRU, SVR, and the rest of the Russian intelligence services understand Article 17 very, very well, and are already thinking about how do you use the capability to legally force companies to forget you exist in a way that you can operate information warfare and make it very, very difficult to investigate it afterwards. The other issues, GDPR is creating an idea of privacy by design that runs directly contrary to the national requirements that have been placed on the big tech platforms from the nation states themselves. And a lot of this comes back to kind of the structure of the European Union and the fact that the European Commission, European Parliament have responsibilities for privacy, but not really responsibility for national security and law enforcement. And it's unclear how this issue is going to be worked out when you have individual countries asking for assistance that is made impossible by Article 17 and 25. Another hard trade-off that exists, not just in Europe, in the United States as well, is the trade-off between anonymity and data integrity and news integrity. These are two examples of real posts that were made and pushed out by the Internet Research Agency in 2016. Both of these were discovered by the Facebook team that I worked with in 2017 and then given to the special counsel and to the congressional committees. And they are examples of the kinds of things the IRA like to do. So one of these, or both of these specifically reference at least one of the candidates in 2016. Most of the content the IRA pushed actually didn't, but some of the most interesting stuff did. And as you can see, they are trying to take both sides of an issue. In one of these cases, they're saying that Satan wants Clinton to win. And in the other one, they are now trying to foment unrest against Trump after the election. And the IRA really themselves is nihilistic. They don't hold these beliefs themselves. They believe that they can stir up and cause divisions inside of American society in a way that will demonstrate that our form of democracy is not a valid form of governance. And so these folks rely upon anonymity, right? These posts only work because people believed they're being posted by other Americans who shared their political beliefs. And this would not work, hopefully, if it said up top, this was posted by somebody in St. Petersburg who's being paid to hold this position. And so this seems like an easy thing to fix. Let's just get rid of anonymity online. Now, obviously, I don't actually hold that position, and one of the reasons is when we look at these kinds of issues, we often look at them from a very Western format, especially an American position, where we know that we can hold a lot of these kinds of positions in a way that's legally safe for us in the United States, and that you could eliminate these freedoms easily from the IRA and hopefully not have too many consequences in the US. But there's lots of people who don't live in legal regimes like that. For example, this is a real photo of the current king of Thailand that was circulating on Facebook and Twitter, and especially on point-to-point messages among people in Thailand as part of their resistance, not really to the king, but to the military junta who has canceled elections, taken over, controls Thailand, and that uses the king and the laws that protect the king's image as a tool against democracy activism. It is illegal to post this picture on the internet in Thailand. I probably will not be able to visit Thailand now that this video is out with my face next to it. That's not surprising and unfortunate. But if I was in Thailand, this would be a spectacularly dangerous thing for me to do. But this is a picture that you saw on Facebook in Thailand, and you could do so because the exact same anonymity that was granted to these people by running their accounts behind pages protected these folks. And it's very difficult to try to square this circle in a way where you're not picking winners and losers. One solution here is you decide that you can have transparency and freedom in some countries and not in others. But I don't think that's a way forward that we want, and I think that would create a very, very dangerous precedent. Overall, in the United States, when we look at these content issues, we're also starting to run into a real basic problem, which is that the United States doesn't have laws and case law around these kinds of decisions because of the First Amendment. The kind of content that people don't want to see on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube is the kind of content that has traditionally been protected by the First Amendment. And as a result, the kind of very American ideals that have gone into the content policies at these companies are not living up to this moment. And so as a result, we see these other countries, like Germany with their NetzDG law, trying to step in and to create a new definition of what is allowable political speech that seems very, very alien to us in the US. It's also a definition that could be very, very dangerous for people in places like Thailand. But a lot of that is due to the fact that we have left this, we have completely seeded the field for this discussion based upon our really stringent protection for speech in this country. So now that I've talked about how hard the problem is, I don't believe that we're totally without solutions here. And I do think we can do a lot better in having these discussions and trying to balance them in a smart way. First, what can we do in academia? So one of the things we can do in academia is we can do a better job with the next generation of leaders in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is famous for not having a lot of memory. The Valley would not work if people understood how many people had failed before, how many people had to move back to Wisconsin and moving back in with their parents after their Series A ran out. It is the fact that people don't remember the failures of the past that make them excited for the potential of the future. But the result of that is also we don't recycle our lessons from the mistakes we made. And so the mistakes that the Googles and the Facebooks and the YouTubes have made are going to be made again and again and again by the next generations of entrepreneurs because they don't learn about it. And that's something that we can do better. And I think that's something here at Stanford we can do a lot better based upon not just our location in the Valley, but the fact that so many Stanford alumni become really important leaders in tech. And so we're addressing this through a number of ways. We have a pretty unique master's program here under FSI that is teaching public policy students the depths of cybersecurity, not just policy, but the technologies and how to work and talk to technologists. We're also teaching a class here specifically for non-CS majors so they can learn the basics of technology and offensive techniques. So when they read a report in the future about bad things that happened, they have done those kinds of things themselves in the lab. And we're going to be continuing with the computer science department, not just to teach ethics, but to teach the hard lessons that have been learned in the past about bullying and harassment, about suicide, about the abuse of children online. Those are the kinds of things that right now you can graduate from Stanford without ever learning. And we're going to build a curriculum so that if you graduate from Stanford, you at least had the option to learn about these mistakes and to not make them yourself. Another way academics can help is by doing good cross-disciplinary research and publishing those findings. One of the real reasons that I believe we are not well prepared in 2018 or 2020 to secure our election is because we're not working off of the same set of facts of what happened in 2016. There was a moment where it looked like we might have the equivalent of a 9/11 commission look into the 2016 election and publish recommendations. And that didn't happen, not just because of partisan politics, but because of a breakdown between the different groups in the House, the different committees, who all believed they had jurisdiction over security. And because those jurisdictional issues couldn't be worked out, we ended up getting nothing. And so a number of people have stepped into this breach. But I'm very, very proud to be part of a team here that Mike McFall put together to study the intelligence failures of 2016 and to provide recommendations to the next Congress when they are seated in February. And so we're going to be working on that project to look at the failures of 2016 through that cross-disciplinary lens, understanding both technologically what happened, but also the policy and operational failures that we can really focus on fixing before 2020. This kind of research is something that probably needs its own home. And one of the things we're really missing in academia is a relationship or tech where these kinds of investigations are based upon real data and the output of our research is extremely effective in actually causing change. And so one of the things we're going to be doing here at Stanford is we're building what we're calling right now the Stanford Internet Observatory. And this is a cross-disciplinary research group with analysts and data scientists and partnerships with NGOs and with tech companies to study these issues in depth and to provide technological support to the quantitative social scientists and the other academics at Stanford who would like to look into the intersection of policy, society, and tech. And so we're going to be building up that capability over the next several months. And while the initial focus will continue to be information warfare and democratic elections, my hope is that if we build this capability, we will be able to be nimble enough to respond to the future events that demonstrate the misuse of tech and the blind spots that we collectively have about the things that we've built. So that's what we can do in academia. What's the responsibility of the tech companies? And I think there's been some real fundamental building blocks in keeping tech from responding really effectively to these problems. The first is that the tech companies have always resisted any kind of regulation. And they've done so, I think, for somewhat good reasons, partially because there's a number of regulations that have been proposed, including that Communications Decency Act, that are on their face not constitutional or not well thought out, but also because all of these companies operate in a multinational framework, and it is very, they have always believed that it is very dangerous to create precedent in the United States that might be followed by other countries. That belief, I think, is crumbling because it's becoming clear now that if the United States does not set up guardrails for the tech companies, those guardrails will be set up around the world, and they will not reflect American values, and they will also probably not be compatible with one another. And we are very quickly moving to the possibility of a fractured internet, where you have multiple internets operating under different legal regimes with only limited ability to communicate between them. And so that lack of cooperation with government, I think, has been a significant problem. Another problem has been the way that we talk about these problems in tech. And the truth is Silicon Valley is based upon optimism. If you look at the things we say about the products we build, it is always about how great they are and how happy we make people and how they're faster and cheaper and greater, and we never ever talk about the downside. And the truth is the world is actually kind of a dark place, and there are people who want to cause others harm, and if you build technology, it will be misused. And it's not bad for us to admit that. And I think that's something, the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem. Tech needs to admit that we have a problem, that we build things that we mean to be used for good purposes, but we have to expect they'll be used for bad. And that doesn't mean that we can build things that are perfect, but at least we can explain to the world the difficulties we're dealing with. And in my experience, coming up with those kinds of the cooperation we need is first based upon the setting the expectation correctly that while imperfect, these companies want to do the right thing. And I think the wall is crumbling both on the policy and comm side, but a bit of a siege mentality has built into Silicon Valley now, where everybody is worried about what is the next scandal, how do we survive this scandal, how do we just move on and get back to the good old days. And my message to my colleagues there would be, I don't think we ever go back to the good old days. We have to expect that this is what the relationship between society and tech is going to be like forever, and that we have to approach it through honesty and openness. And one of the first things we got to do is we've got to admit that these companies are acting in a quasi-governmental manner and have to be much more transparent to match that. The major tech companies are serving billions of people, and they are running small intelligence agencies whose job it is to track and stop foreign adversaries. They are protecting individuals from attack, and they are making the decisions about what is acceptable political discourse in democracies around the world. There is no way around seeing these companies as having some kind of governmental responsibility. But unlike most democratic governments, they lack the accountability or transparency that comes with real democracy. And there's not a good, simple solution to that. Because if you make these companies completely subservient to democracies around the world, and even if it was just democracies, you will end up with rules that are not compatible and them trying to apply completely different visions of things like speech controls all to one platform. Nor would you ever really be able to hold the bulwark against authoritarian countries trying to use the same powers to use these tools of repression. So while I don't think you can make them completely democratically accountable, what you can first do is work on transparency. And I think the first place to start there is transparency around content moderation. One of the problems that companies have is they have been pushed into making decisions they never wanted to make. They did not want to have to decide who is a Nazi in 2018. That sounds like it should be an easy question to answer, but it turns out to be a very complicated and nuanced question to answer, and they don't want to have to make those decisions, but they are going to have to. They've been forced in that position. And right now they are making those decisions in a black box, in an unaccountable manner where the decisions are never explained to people on the outside. And if you're going to run a judicial system like this, which is effectively what they're doing, you have to show how the sausage is made. You have to show how the laws are applied and how precedent is applied, because the only way people are going to accept decisions that they disagree with is if they see that the decision was made in a way that eventually will come down on their side. But right now, the companies have made the decision in a way that it only motivates everybody to work the ref. And that's what you're starting to see now, is that everybody is, that both political sides, not just the United States, but around the world, is going to get more and more strident about pushing for censorship of people they disagree with. And the only way out of that trap is going to be through transparency and demonstrating how these decisions are made. Now, you can't do transparency in the same way a court system does, through huge decisions written by judges and handed down on a weekly or monthly basis. If you do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, I'm pretty sure that Facebook makes more content moderation decisions in one day than the US justice system makes all year, right? And so you clearly can't have like a traditional justice system, but you can have more transparency and algorithmic transparency in a way that doesn't exist right now. And Silicon Valley has solved harder problems than that in the past. When it comes to the actual products the Valley builds, the real problem is that companies are not measuring the right things. I wrote a goodbye letter, effectively. People called it a memo. People don't write memos in Silicon Valley. That implies that you dictated something that got typed up and run off a mimeograph machine and put in people's slots. It was a Facebook post, right? So I wrote a Facebook post saying goodbye to folks when we announced internally that I was leaving. In it, I tried to point out to people that the problems the company was facing at the time was not based upon decisions made by 3 or 4 people in a conference room, which is how the media honestly portrays it from the outside. The decisions that were causing trouble were the tens of thousands of little product decisions that were made by product managers and engineers and operational specialists who were measuring the wrong things about these products and who were incentivized to push the products in the wrong way. And I think people don't understand that Silicon Valley companies are really, really, really good at measuring how these products are used, and almost every decision about how they are built in the future comes out of those numbers. Every time you use any tech product, everything you do is a tiny little vote that you like it works this way, and if there's a place you get confused or you drop off or you stop using the product, that's a vote that's a part of the product that has to change. Unfortunately, these metrics, it is really easy to determine whether somebody's using a product. It's really easy to ask them, did that feature make you happy? It's really hard to measure, is this product making people better informed? Is it making them better citizens? Is it actually improving their life versus giving them a really short dopamine hit? And Silicon Valley is going to have to figure out how to measure those much more difficult, sometimes intangible elements of the product usage experience, because otherwise they will continue, no matter how much good people want to do, no matter what people say, if they continue to measure those old metrics, the products will go right back into causing harm, both on a micro and a macro level. And if you really want to make change in the Valley, you've got to change the metrics, and that will change the products, and that will eventually change the world. And then finally, I think one of the big failures in Silicon Valley has been our inability to find a good economic model for news, for journalism, and especially for local journalism. Just today, a good friend of mine from both Yahoo and Facebook held a memorial service for her brother because he was killed 13 days ago by the San Mateo Sheriff's Department in Millbrae. And she's a human rights activist who has to deal with a human rights violation right here in California. But most of you have probably not heard about that because there's been almost no news coverage. And there's almost nobody asking the questions necessary to hold the government accountable for the decisions that led to the death of this man. And I think a part of that is in the Bay Area, we no longer have a strong local newspaper. Despite this being an incredibly rich part of the world that is the home of perhaps the most influential industry in the world, we don't have journalists here to ask those kinds of questions. And a lot of that lies on the shoulders of Silicon Valley. Nobody wanted to destroy the newspaper industry, but this was a consequence of allowing anybody to be a journalist and taking away the economics of things like classified sections in local commerce. And unfortunately, nobody in the Valley has stepped up to fix it. And so as a result, we're moving towards a world where there are a small number of successful national news gathering organizations, and they are either on TV and showing TV ads, or they're print and they're putting their information behind paywalls. And so we're moving towards a world where rich people get good journalism and poor people get clickbait. And I don't think that's a world where our democracy continues to survive very well. And this is something that can be solved. It is not as hard as a number of the monetization problems that have been solved in Silicon Valley. We just need the willpower, and we need one of, honestly, 3 companies to do it. Either Amazon, Google, or Facebook are really the only companies that have the reach and the capability to solve this problem. And hopefully one or all of them really start tackling it. Because whatever the companies do to fix other kinds of issues, our society is not going to be healthy if we don't have an economic model for good journalism. A couple other things we need to think about. From a government perspective, we need to think about who is responsible for securing our systems and for coordinating cyber defense. The United States has hyper-competent offensive capabilities at US Cyber Command and at the NSA. We do not have the equivalent on the defensive side. The FBI is very, very good at what they do, but the FBI is a law enforcement agency, and they are not set up to do this kind of all-of-society coordination that we need to protect things like the 2018 election. And this is really unfortunate because I've seen places where it works, perhaps not better in every way, but better in some ways, including like in France and Germany, where there were elections shortly after the US election, where I was able to meet with the directors of ANSI, which is the French cybersecurity agency, and BSI, the German cybersecurity agency, and was able to work with a single partner that could help us protect campaigns, protect individual candidates, and build a reporting structure for disinformation and misinformation. That does not exist in the United States right now. And it's too late for 2018, but it doesn't have to be late for 2020 for the United States to figure this out. And then for other countries, especially the EU, I think one of the things that European countries have to think about is they have to think about what is the consistent future that they want. Right now, you effectively have different parts of European society asking for all of those equities on that star, and then putting, in some cases, massive financial penalties behind some of the equities and no financial penalties behind the others. And so I think you can understand how even well-meaning companies that are responsible to their shareholders are going to respond to that. They're going to respond to those problems that have a cattle prod behind them and ignore the things where people are asking nicely. And that means that we're going to have some really unbalanced decision-making of how companies operate in Europe. What I would like to see is European politicians to think a little more consistently about the vision of what they want to do, and to think about that vision not as a competition strategy, but as actually the kind of world they want to build, whether that world is being built by US or European companies. But in the end, we're going to have to take responsibility as citizens. First, we're going to have to take responsibility for not using our cell phones at concerts, which these people are the worst. Just don't do that. That's a horrible thing. But we're also going to have to take responsibility for how we use tech and the kind of impact that has. We all need to be better about what is the news we consume, what is the information we believe, and what do we share with other people. But we're also going to have to be responsible for when we ask for changes to make sure we are okay with those changes being applied to people we agree with. There's a lot of excitement, especially among people with whom I politically agree with a lot of times. There's a lot of excitement for controlling what other people say, what other people read, what other people are allowed to do online. And I just want to warn people that this is not the kind of problem that we can just easily throw a rule down that you are not allowed to do this one thing that causes this problem. We're going to have to be really careful not to create levers of power that we don't want to exist for very long times. The norms that we are setting right now are going to exist for decades. And the truth is those norms are going to get much more dangerous. Because right now, a lot of these decisions are being made by humans. Because human beings have to decide, is this post pro-Nazi? They have to decide, is this an ISIS recruiting post? That is not going to be true perhaps 5 years from now. 5 years from now, the machine learning technologies are going to be at the place where these kinds of decisions are going to be able to be made by computers at computer speed without a human looking over their shoulder. And I know we were all worried for a long time about the Terminator, but the actual dystopian future is graphics cards made by NVIDIA deciding what is acceptable political discussion online. And that is the future we have to expect is coming. And so the decisions we make right now, we got to make sure when we make those levers of power that we're okay with the hands of people we disagree with being on those levers, and the hands of perhaps robots being on those levers. Because when you create those levers of power, traditionally, it has only been the powerful hands that's been on it, right? And controlling what people do and say online is the kind of thing that in the long run is not going to help the dispossessed. It is not going to help the people who are not powerful currently. It is going to help the power consolidate their power. And I think that's a lesson we can learn from a number of different countries around the world. And so we have some serious problems we need to work on. But while we work on those problems, we also have to focus on the fact that the internet is one of the most powerful tools for human freedom and democratization ever created. And got to keep that in mind, that that is a future that we can still have if we're very careful in asking for it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. Very thought-provoking, and the conversation continues. I now want to welcome up my colleague, Andy Grotto. For those of you who don't know Andy, he's a CSAC research fellow and lecturer, and also a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution. And before coming to Stanford, Andy was the senior director for cybersecurity at the White House for both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. So Andy's going to have a conversation with Alex and then open it up to some of your questions, which I think he's collected on note cards there. And so go to it.
Great. Thanks, Colin. Thank you all for joining us. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, awesome. Mr. Grotto.
So let me just start by saying what a thrill it is to have Alex join the team here at Stanford. I got here last September and have just been amazed and impressed at the leadership that Mike McFall and Dan Bonet have put into the cyber initiative, the hard work that Rod Ewing, Amy Ziegert, the former CSAC director, and now Colin Call are putting into building this program, and I'm just really excited about where it's headed. So I thought I'd start with, and so let me just briefly give a quick kind of logistical note here, which is that if you have questions, you'll find people circulating the room with note cards. Write your question on a note card, pass to one of them, and they'll shuttle them up here. We're gonna talk amongst ourselves for a little while here, and then I'll turn to audience questions. So the first question I wanted to put past you, Alex, is a prominent theme in your presentation was there's a challenge around drawing a line between where the private sector's responsibility to deal with these challenges ends and the government's begins. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, can that line be drawn in a principled way? And to the extent that inevitably a line gets drawn, it's a question of whether it's done purposefully or not, how should we think about ways to draw that line in a principled way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a pretty fundamental issue. I mean, right now it's certainly not a principled way, right? Right now you end up with lots of decisions made for immediate expediency on the company side because they want to get out of trouble, and on the government side, I think often not just based upon the problems they want to solve, but what they feel comfortable solving, right? And you see this over and over again of the application of the tools at hand, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So in the companies, what tool do you have to deal with people who are abusing your platform? Well, you can ban their accounts and you can kick them off Facebook. And there's been a couple of cases where you sue spammers and stuff where you can figure out. But for the most part, those are the only tools. And what are the tools on the government side? Well, if you're the FBI, it's to arrest people. It's for 2 years later, you indict people for stuff where the effect and the after effects have already been felt. And I think we've got to at least move away from drawing those lines based only upon what kind of tools we currently have at hand, because that is going to end up with us, I think, over-legalizing on the government side and treating things as not as important as necessary, because we just don't have the enforcement tools on the platform side to deal with a lot of them. The good way to do it, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it'd be very difficult to just have like a constitutional convention of this is how cyberspace should be run in the relationship with the government. We probably need to start with each of these individual problem sets and the equities, and most likely you will continue to have what's kind of going on right now, which is effectively the government and the companies ship MVP, minimally viable product, as we call it, and then you have to iterate make the changes. And so like what you saw around election security is pretty much that. The companies put some stuff together. The government has said, okay, great, this is ways we can help out. They've kind of just shipped it. We can see how that works in 2018. And then realistically on this problem, hopefully we can readdress the issue for 2020 of actually coming up with a more thoughtful framework of whose responsibility is what.
So yeah, no, I think you made the point in your presentation that about how the products the platforms produce are the result of in some cases tens of thousands of micro decisions by individual engineers.
Right.
And that what I heard you say is that the way to sort of get out of that situation is to develop better metrics and use that to try to steer these ships. How should we think about developing those metrics? From your perspective, do you have any thoughts on what those metrics might look like and how we might go about building them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's two sets. There's the micro metrics and the macro metrics, right? And only the micro metrics are things that you can probably pivot off very quickly. The macro metrics tell you if you're going the right direction. And so the macro is ethnic violence in places where there's violence. Do we believe that we are part of that? It's probably measurements of overall sentiment around like ethno-religious sentiment, hate, things that we would classify as hate speech in the West, whether that sentiment is increasing or decreasing in certain regions. On a micro level, what you're probably more doing is trying to measure whether or not individual people are making the decisions that you think eventually take you to a good place. So if, one of the things that Facebook's gotten in trouble for is trusting people when they tell it what they want and don't want on the newsfeed. And so it turns out people click on really aggressive stuff, right? Like if something is very aggressive and captures your eye, the BuzzFeed listicle, right? The you won't believe what happened next kind of optimization, that sends the message to the computer, I want to see more of this. And so you can't ask the question, did somebody click on this and interact with it? What you really got to measure is something like, did people spend a reasonable amount of time on this? Or what happened after they read this piece? Did they comment on it? Did they share it with somebody else? Is that their reasonable time? And I know some of those metrics have been created of things like, are people just resharing without reading articles? That's something that you should measure going down, right? And so you also have the counter metrics of the things you don't want to see. And you definitely don't want to see people saying, okay, great, I believe I know everything about this article just from the headline, therefore I'm going to push it into 5 different places to share it with as many people as possible. That's exactly the kind of thing you want to drive down as well.
Yeah, and so how do you see, so those metrics all make sense to me. I mean, what are the right mix of incentives to encourage and incent companies to actually develop them and implement them? Does that come from government? Does it come from the market? Where do you see that sourced?
Yeah, and that's tough because the government has such broad tools for incentivizing behavior, and it's all based upon, generally based upon breaking of laws, right? That you have, here's a specific rule that we can prove that you broke, and there's not a lot of ways that the government, outside of tax breaks, incentivizes much more broad behavior that can't be really specifically defined. I think it's got to come from consumers, right? So the companies need to hear that they don't like the way this product makes them feel, and that they're happier. Now, the flip side is some of these metrics, I think, aren't only going to make people, one of the things you want to measure is whether you're making people more informed. Making people more informed might make them unhappier these days. And so I think that's another hard part is you're going to have to make those decisions of, well, somebody's incredibly well informed and incredibly depressed. Is that okay for us? Or do we only want to make them happy, in which case everything goes towards Candy Crush, right? That is a much harder trade-off, and I don't think government should make those decisions. I think this is a let 1,000 flowers bloom, and consumers with kind of coordination from folks in the media, NGOs of pushing people in the right directions need to vote with their feet and to use the features that make them happy. But it's not, I don't see a way that you can really incentivize that other than to continue to ask for it, and then to probably incentivize much more small behavior around privacy and security that I think is much more measurable.
So yeah, on the theme of privacy, from my perspective, 2019 looks to be a pretty active year in the United States around privacy. So some of you may know California passed a consumer privacy law in it was like September, August. And now there's a lot of buzz in Washington around the Congress developing a law that would preempt the California law. how do you see this playing out? And from, do you think there ought to be a federal privacy law? And if so, what do you see as what metrics would you use to judge whether that law is appropriate or not?
Yeah, I think we need a federal privacy law, and I think we need a competent federal privacy regulator to turn that law into specific decisions and to do so in a quick and predictable fashion.
FTC?
No, it's not FTC, right? Because there's good people at FTC, so I don't want to badmouth them too much. Like, I know a lot of ex-FTC people who are really thoughtful, but the FTC's mandate comes out of this idea of enforcing unfair business practices, right? And of which in the cyber world effectively comes down to, did you lie about the use of data? Did you tell people we care about security and then you had a breach? Or do you say something in your privacy policy, which really just motivates companies to have a privacy policy that says, we will completely screw you with your data as much as possible, right? You're like, oh, well, you can't say it was unfair or misleading. That is not a good way to enforce privacy law. Like, we need to have real applicable rules on what is the data I can collect and for what purposes can I keep it. And if I'm keeping this kind of data, how should I store it? Which is where I think the GDPR conversation gets really complicated, because while the goals of GDPR are for the most part laudable, although in some cases completely contradictory, we can talk more about that, the figuring out how that applies specifically to the technology on the ground is spectacularally difficult because of the explosion of the number of DPAs, and then also
DPA.
I'm sorry, Data Protection Authority, right? So there are 28 or 28, I think, national data protection authorities, and then because of some quirk of history, Germany has state and city-state level.
And DPAs are the organizations that enforce.
They enforce the privacy law. So the city of Hamburg, which has I believe a smaller population than Santa Clara County, where we're sitting right now, has its own data protection authority that gets to come up with its own interpretation of GDPR. Now, there are mechanisms that are supposed to bring these interpretations together, but that part isn't done. And so it is very difficult to incentivize good behavior when companies don't know at what point they're going to be granted, safety, right? And so I think we need a federal law. We do not want to have 50. I think it's great that California passed their law because it now forces Congress to act, right? But I do think we need a federal override that wipes out the California law, because we cannot have a future where you have 50 state laws with 50 different state attorney generals enforcing it. And then we need a federal regulator with teeth and with the ability to have people that are technically competent enough to interpret these things. And that can happen. Like, of the DPAs, the Irish is actually, the Irish Data Protection Authority, I think DPC, I think in that case, the Data Protection Commission, is actually really competent. They have a lot of competent technologists who have worked for tech companies. And so it is a doable thing. It's just in the United States, we've never had any agency with that kind of responsibility. And I mean, what are you shooting for? I think the first thing is, like, I had those 3 circles, is the first thing you got to attack the red circle, right? Like, there's a lot of people collecting a lot of data they don't need for the actual functioning of the product. And so we I think one of the big focuses should be bringing data collection practices in line with what people expect from how it works, right? So if I use WhatsApp and it uses phone numbers, I expect it to have my contact info. I don't expect it, and it doesn't do this, but like, I would not expect it to track my GPS location all the time, right? But there are a bunch of, does anybody here wonder why there's so many flashlight apps on the app stores, right? And like, what's the economic model for having 27 different flashlight apps? It's because they have frameworks that they pull in from advertising companies that gather a huge amount of data off your phone, and people don't expect when they turn the flashlight on for your phone to be fingerprinted and for all this data to be pulled in and then sent into an insecure S3 bucket on Amazon. And so I think focusing on bringing data collection techniques in line with what the expectation is using the product is going to have to be the focus.
And to come back to the institutional enforcement piece of this, if not the FTC, then who? Do you think we need a new agency? Is it a matter of taking the FTC and transforming it in some way? How would you tackle that?
Yeah, I think it's something like the CFPB, right? The Financial Products Bureau, that you'll have to create a new agency with some independence from the White House that has continuity and has people that are really capable about making those rules.
Yeah.
The interesting question is then, what's the relationship between, if you're going to make a new agency, should also have overall cybersecurity rulemaking authority, right? Which right now you have DHS and NIST kind of promulgating things, but you don't have a single agency whose responsibility is to set cybersecurity standards in the US. That's a really interesting question. Like, you might be trying to boil the ocean if you create one agency for that. It also might be a lot of efficiencies if you have a one-stop shop regulator for the major tech companies for both privacy and security, since clearly there's a massive overlap there.
Yeah, and people forget that, right? That a core privacy principle is security, which strikes me as perhaps the most challenging of the different privacy principles to pin down in statute, because unlike questions of consent, either you did or did not get consent, unlike questions about data usage, either you did or didn't use the data the way you were supposed to. Security is a risk management exercise,
right,
which you know well from your experience in risk management. How, my sense is that will be one of the most challenging and fraught dimensions of privacy legislation to pin down in a satisfying way.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to members of Congress as they inevitably take this up next year? And I should just offer one point of background. The California law goes into effect, at least it's drafted today, in 2020. And so there's a real political pressure in Washington to do something in 2019. And so I think we'll see an active debate. What would your advice be to members of Congress on this security question specifically?
Yeah, it's tough. One of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to end up in a place where you have very specific implementation rules being promulgated for all of industry, right? So the most quote unquote successful regulatory framework in American industry for cybersecurity is probably the PCI DSS. So that's the Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standards.
Which is not a regulation, though. That's an
not regulation.
Driven. Yeah, right.
But is effectively a regulation, because if you want to be a company that takes credit cards, you have to follow it, right? The credit card companies use their not oligopoly, I guess, according to the courts, but what looks kind of like an oligopoly, to say that here's a security standard you have to follow if you're going to take any credit cards. And there's multiple levels, right? If you're a mom and pop shop, it's different than if you're Google and you're taking billions and billions of dollars in credit cards, right? Every single company that has had 150 million credit card numbers stolen was PCI DSS level 1 certified, right? So you have that kind of regulation demonstrates that there is a value in creating a target for people to shoot up to, and it has had positive impacts, especially in the mom and pops and stuff, especially because it's pushed them off of running their own credit card systems and onto Stripe and PayPal and the companies that have security teams. So I think regulation that pushes companies towards consolidation, to putting more eggs into fewer, more secure baskets, is actually not a bad thing. But what you don't want to do is then create as specific rules as possible on the high end, so that people are either aiming down or they consider, oh, we're PCI certified, that's good enough. Because it clearly, by definition, is not, if you look at the overall security of the credit card ecosystem. And so what we don't want to do is have like a national PCI. I think that would be tough. It might have to just come to some kind of risk management through civil liability plus insurance. And I think the insurance industry is moving much more quickly than they were a couple of years ago to actually having standards for when they insure companies that are based upon the real risk, instead of just asking, I filled out an application for a large company a couple of years ago, and it was like, do you run antivirus? Yes or no? That's like a question mark. And this is a company that had hundreds of thousands of production servers. Like, yes, we run antivirus. And like, it's just not like, there's no real risk management. And I think pushing that stuff to the insurance industry to try to make those fine-grained decisions might actually be a smart way to do it too.
Let's shift gears a little bit. I mean, we've spent some time talking about the United States, but obviously, the set of issues crosses national borders, international borders. I know you're interested in India in particular as a country of focus. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like India is where the future is going to be written, both from an information warfare perspective and from a regulatory perspective, right? You have the US going its own direction, the EU, Russia and China with their own regulatory regimes. And then a lot of people, I think a lot of unaligned countries looking to India of what they're going to do. Can they bring the American companies to heel? Can they get compliance from these huge multinationals? How are they going to adapt these rules to fit Indian society? And India is fascinating in that its election is next year, April or May of next year. I think it is probably the most important election next year from an information warfare perspective. And part of it is their mix of adversaries who are involved is very complicated and includes, it looks like, groups who are working on behalf of all the major political parties. So the call is coming from inside the house, right, when it comes to India. The other thing that technically makes it interesting is that the most interesting internet use in India for this is the use of WhatsApp, which has supplanted phone calls and SMS as the primary mechanism for point-to-point communication in India. WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. None of that data is available to WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, or to the Indian government, or to any government. And so the enforcement capabilities of stopping disinformation there is incredibly limited. And so when you have a situation where the ruling political party is pushing WhatsApp propaganda, and then at the same time they're saying WhatsApp needs to drop encryption so that they can take care of propaganda, I think that makes for a very volatile situation. And we have to be very careful for those of us outside of India to not get played by any of the groups internally who are looking to bend us towards their will. And I think that especially applies to the tech companies, because Modi is seen as the tech prime minister, as he got into power through the utilization of the social media platforms, and is very friendly with a number of folks here. We can't allow our companies to get used in a way that might be seen as putting their thumbs on the scale there. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out over the next couple of months.
Yeah, in India, I mean, as you know, also last year, the Supreme Court ruled that Indians have a fundamental right to privacy, and there's been a lively debate and a series of initiatives in India to craft a privacy framework. The language that the court used in India sounds a lot like the language that's used to underpin GDPR in Europe. So stay tuned on that. Why don't we turn to? I've got a stack and a growing stack of audience questions. So why don't we?
We did some content moderation, right, Harold?
Oh yeah. All right. So I'll start with. Let's see here, and this is.
So this is what we
start
call
with-
an algorithmic newsfeed here.
All right. It's artificial intelligence.
Yes, exactly.
What part of 1996 style internet independence and sovereignty from offline governments is possible and worth it to save for the future? And I'll just add a footnote to that, which is that coming back to Barlow's statement, because I think that's what this is a reference to. I mean that was aspirational at the time, right?
Yeah.
It didn't reflect reality in 1996. So I mean, your talk was called "The Battle for the Soul of the Internet." I mean, how would you describe the internet's soul? Not to get too metaphysical.
Jeez, yeah.
I was a philosophy major's undergrad, so.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was an electrical engineering undergrad, and I went to public school, so you got to be careful. You got to go slow with me. So I mean, to the original question, to the 1996, I think it is still, part of his writing is that this aspirational idea of the internet as a liberation technology, right? As something that innately gives people more freedom than they had before they had it, right? That the day after you get a smartphone, your life is better and you have more freedoms than you had the day before. That's kind of, I don't think he says it explicitly, but it's kind of built into the idea. That is clearly not true, but we can still try to strive for that being as true as possible, right? I think that survives. I think the part that survives the least is the idea that cyberspace is something that stands alone, right? That you can carve out this world of, in sci-fi terms, that you put your goggles on and you're in the cyber world, and then you take your goggles off and your life is totally different. There will always be this overlap between the real and the not real. And that's not just governments, but that is the use of the internet to cause real world harm, of which there is a tiny little amount of conversation compared to the actual harm that is caused, of the kids that commit suicide, about the people who are trafficked, about the children that are groomed, about the people who are defrauded and have their life savings stolen because their title company had their Gmail account hacked, right? Though the discussion of that is actually, there's way too little of that. And if you're somebody who has to actually pay attention to those issues, it becomes very, very clear that that idea that the cyber world stands apart will never be true.
So on that theme, I mean, how can the fragmentation of the internet be prevented when various world governments have such drastically different priorities? Just to come back to your multi-point star here, is it possible to, it's hard enough to optimize that in one jurisdiction. Is balkanization inevitable given the complexity of equities here?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, if you look in the crystal ball, maybe this is inevitable. It might be inevitable that you end up with many different internets. I think if
would that be a bad thing? I mean, let's pick on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Would that necessarily be a bad thing?
Do you think it's better for the Chinese people for them to effectively have their own intranet that they are on? I'm not sure I would say that, right? I think the balkanization in many cases then makes it much easier to turn the internet into a tool of control.
So what we mean by balkanization is essentially a content, an internet defined by rules around what is and isn't permissible.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's many different types of balkanization. There's actual network balkanization, right, which you have a little bit with China. There's the economic and legal balkanization, which you have all of China. If you want to operate in China, any kind of service, it has to be 51% owned by a joint venture, by a Chinese company. You can't, just own it. So, I think this is a hard question because we haven't defined it. Where I think the best we could shoot for right now is maybe 2 or 3 different internets that then everybody else signs up for, and then focus on as much interoperability between them, right? It is not it is very possible that you can have products operate differently in, say, the EU and North America and still be interoperable, that I can have Facebook friends in Europe, that the apps on my phone continue to work when I go to Europe.
Cell phones used to be this way.
Sorry?
Cell phones used to be this way.
Yeah, cell phones used to be this way, right. So I think that is possible, but it's only possible if, one, the number of different internets is actually reasonably small, like 3 or 4, and if the goals of the regulation are not completely divergent. And that's why you can't have compatibility like that with the Chinese internet, because their goal is societal information control in a way that is not true elsewhere, and you just can't, there's no way to square that circle.
Which gets to another question from the audience here, which is, what this is an easy one. What do you think about Google building a special search platform for China that conforms to government restrictions? What is the decision-making framework that tech companies should use in these cases?
Yeah, I think there is a hard question here that actually, in theory, is hard. In this case, I think it's easy. In theory, the question is, are people there better off by having an American company, kind of grudgingly, go through the paces and do the things the Chinese want to enter the market, and then provide something that is better than what they get right now from a freedom perspective? In theory, that seems like a hard problem. I think in practice, with what I know about the Dragonfly project, which is only public information, but what I know from
Say thing, what's a Dragonfly?
So Dragonfly is the purported internal code name, according to leaked documents, of Google creating a censored version of their search engine for China, which, unlike the previous Google entry into China pre-2009, would actually be operated by a joint venture under current Chinese rules, meaning a Chinese company would own the infrastructure, is my understanding, and would have a lot of access to user data on it. So Google 2008, I think that was fine. Like, they censored Google, they censored the search, but they resisted lots and lots of data requests. And the government did not have a backdoor to get that data, is my understanding, which is why the Chinese had to break in 2009. Effectively, the Aurora attacks proved the Chinese did not have all the data they wanted from Google. What I know,
what were the Aurora attacks?
I'm sorry, the Aurora attacks were the attacks by the People's Liberation Army against 35 tech companies. Google figured it out on their network and then warned everybody else. And that was a big deal for the tech companies. It was kind of like, man, we're playing in the big leagues now. We've got the Chinese army trying to break in. It really, people got pretty gunned up after that. It built up good security teams. But I think these days, with what I've read about Dragonfly and what I know about current rules in China, it would be impossible to enter the market and still be consistent with those values. The truth is China is overall a humongous ethical black hole for Silicon Valley. We treat Chinese people differently than we treat anybody else on the planet. And there's some kind of I want to say fundamentally racist idea that you can treat Chinese people differently because somehow they have consented to how their government operates and how life is there. And so we will do things as tech companies that we would never do in the West. And that includes companies that really care about privacy. Apple did a deal where your iCloud data in China, including the encryption keys, is stored on machines controlled by a company that is Chinese and has links to the Chinese government, right? It is unclear right now if Chinese people can use iPhones securely in China. They have not documented how the encryption would actually protect from that. Obviously, all of these products are built in not great conditions in China. It's a place where a lot of our ethical concerns go to die, and I think it's actually really, really sad. And I think I think Google would lose their soul. Like the last vestige of don't be evil, right? That would be completely gone if they re-entered the Chinese market like this. I think it's a total self-justification. And I think from the people I've talked to, management is underestimating the risk to their both recruiting capability and their ability to retain their current talent if they make a decision like that.
And can a company remain globally competitive in this domain without being in China?
Yeah, I think so, yes. But it is hard. And it's obvious why these folks want to be in China because it provides a huge, not just the money, but the data you get from having all those people is going to be really important. But I do think you could probably, the truth is Facebook's blocked in China, and I think you could say Facebook is very competitive in a number of different fields. And that's working out just fine. I think realistically, that is right now with how the direction China is going, you probably can't have both. The flip side being, it is not clear that Chinese companies that grow up under those rules can be globally competitive. While WeChat is really, really popular, for example, with the Chinese diaspora and people who speak, who have friends in China and family, it has not taken off in a competitive fashion to WhatsApp in India, for example. And so I think there is a devil's bargain that you make to operate there that might reduce your competitiveness elsewhere.
Yeah, and this dynamic, is. China's a unique case for a lot of reasons, not least of which is the nature of its government. But this question of what an appropriate relationship between the private sector and the government is obviously a theme that you covered in your remarks. You and I have discussed here. And
I don't think we have to over pivot to the Chinese, right? The countries we've got to care about are the Indias and the Brazils and the unaligned countries that are democracies, but perhaps without the kind of constitutional protections we have. Mm-hmm. We need to focus on those countries and helping them in a good path. The Chinese are going to do what the Chinese are going to do. They're huge, they're powerful, they're a superpower. They're going to make their own decisions. We have to, I think, be careful not to over pivot on internet governance questions only thinking about China. Yeah, and that gets me to the last question for today, which is on the same theme, which is, what do you think of private companies' responsibilities to gather, investigate, and assist law enforcement with cases against cyber criminals and nation states? Yeah, that's a tough one, and I think this goes hand in hand with what the data access rules are, right? You either have to have a situation where the government can get arbitrary access to data on request, perhaps with minimal process, or the companies have to have their own enforcement capability. If you say no to both of those things, then you end up with a massive explosion of lawlessness that is just not stable, right? And so we've moved into a world where the ability for the government to get data is actually quite restricted, especially in non-national security situations. And so it is up to the companies to do their own enforcement. So for example, the Internet Research Agency investigation we did is something the government could never do, right? Under its current legal framework, because Facebook could never legally give to the government all the data, nor do I think they should, but legally give to the government all the data necessary to do that kind of search. And the government doesn't have the power to order it. And so that's the kind of thing that has to be a cooperative decision that the companies feel they will do the investigation and they will then turn the data over under process after they have found who the bad guys are. And that is, again, a weird place. The companies are acting in a quasi-legal, a quasi-governmental situation. They are running small law enforcement agencies, small intelligence agencies. But in the long run, there's not a lot of solutions here other than to allow that to continue to happen and to push for reasonable internal controls inside the companies and to continue to keep rules focused on proper legal process. And I think things like the Cloud Act are actually a reasonable balancing solution to allow that kind of relationship to exist between the US tech companies and other democracies, because that's where that whole system breaks down really right now, is that kind of enforcement does not work as well for Europe, in Australia, in other places where I think we safely can have those relationships.
Well, I've enjoyed this immensely. I hope you all have too. I learned a lot. Before we say goodbye to our guest, we want to honor the CSAC tradition of the Drell lecture, and so we'll invite Rod Ewing to come back up.
Yep. Yeah, so it's here. So Alex, thank you for your talk and your stimulating ideas. As you walk around CSAC, you'll see that we honor our colleagues who publish books by framing the books, hanging the framed images on our walls. And we also honor the lecturers with a poster that announced your seminar, your presentation. So this is your copy. There'll be a copy on the wall shortly to celebrate today and your contributions to CSAC. Another.
I'm worried about this one.
Yeah. So this is the more important presentation. So we're keenly aware of your Berkeley roots.
Me too, for the record.
And
Go Bears.
as well dressed as you are, there's some concern that you aren't prepared for the big game in the way that we would like you to be prepared.
Is there an axe in there? Can I take that?
There's no axe.
Oh.
But I want to say,
Right.
Oh my God.
welcome to Stanford.
Thanks, Rod. Thank you.
Okay, good. And that brings us to the end of a really exciting presentation and discussion. So my thanks to the audience.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy.